Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Mike Hunter. I'm a volunteer here at the Electronic Music Education and Preservation Project. And I'm honored today to have with me Mr. John Chowning, who is joining us from places far away. John, thanks for joining us today.
I'm in Palo Alto, California.
Palo Alto. Very good. Certainly nice weather out there. So, John, we're here to talk to you about your influential work in the area of FM synthesis.
Mm-hmm.
My first question is, I'm kind of curious, is when I talk to people who come from the musical world or from the academic world, I'm always interested in how they found themselves on the path that they ended up being on. So clearly you started out as a musician.
Yeah, I started out as a violinist as a kid, about 8 years old. And so when I got into high school, they needed a cymbal player in the high school band. This was in Mount Pleasant High School in Wilmington, Delaware.
Mm-hmm.
And so because I can read music, they asked me if I would be a cymbal player. You know, it's so important that cymbal players be able to read music because they don't want to come in at the wrong time. It's
Certainly.
usually pretty noticeable. So as a cymbal player, I was standing next to drummers. And I thought that looks like a lot more fun than playing cymbals. And because I can read music, I picked that up pretty quickly. And I became a passionate drummer on the basis of a demonstration drummer of some Puerto Rican salesman who was what we call a rudimentary drummer, played in one of the drum and bugle corps and a competitive one. And he gave a demonstration of this super precise drumming that set my mind afire. I contacted him after this demonstration at the high school kind of congregation and asked him if I could study with him. And he said, sure, come on over. I'll teach you what I know, which was a lot. And I realized something very important in life, that if I really was passionate about something, I could do amazing things. And I became a really good rudimentary drummer. Okay. Then the Korean War hit. My whole interest in high school was music. I sang, played drums, as I just explained, and I was not at all interested in academics, and I sort of squeezed out of high school with a kind of a kick in the pants, and so the question is, what happens to someone who comes out of high school during the Korean War? They're either drafted and sent to Korea, or they could enlist, which I did. I tried out for the Navy Music School in Washington, D.C., passed with no problem, and they let me in, and I spent 3 years on an aircraft carrier, a couple of them actually, in a jazz band. Now, these jazz bands in those years were filled with really good musicians who also wanted to avoid going to Korea.
Sure.
Yeah, and one of them was a alto sax player who was a fabulous musician, and he ended up being one of the High-Lows, which was a group back in those days, more or less followed the Four Freshmen, which was a four male singers, and the High-Lows were super good.
Wow.
And he was that quality of musician, and the others is too. Well, as a rudimentary drummer, I wasn't the best trap drummer, and this was a jazz band. So again, I worked my butt off and got myself up to speed so that I could perform and support the band in a manner appropriate to their ability and style. So that was lesson 2. Put your mind to it, practice like hell, and you can get something done. after uh, the I exited the service, I was on the GI Bill, and then I went to Wittenberg University, which had a small music department my father thought would be compatible with my interests, and they let me in provisionally if I could make at least a C average my first semester. So I was scared to death because, as I said earlier, I had no academic qualifications. So I worked my butt off the first quarter and realizing again, if I put my mind to it, I could do it. And I did. So I got all A's, and they were surprised, accused me of cheating and all sorts of
Oh,
things.
wow.
Yeah, yeah, it was a bit touchy. And in those days, they required new freshmen to wear beanies. And
Okay.
these guys came up to me. And, I was like 3 years older than all of them. Well, they were the upper fraternity, so I was kind of their age, but I was 3 years older than the other freshmen. They said, "Hey, you got to wear a beanie." And I said, "Look, I just got out of the Navy, wear some goddamn sailor hat, and I'm not going to put on a beanie for you guys." And
Right.
they saw that I was serious and backed off. So I graduated from Wittenberg and with a degree in music theory composition, and then went to Paris to study music. And I got a chance to study with Nadia Boulanger, who was a famous teacher at the time, who taught lots of people in this generation. And no, there's a whole list. Uh, she she refused to take Gershwin. She said, "You're good. I have nothing to teach you."
Well,
And
yeah, she wasn't wrong.
yeah, she wasn't wrong. But she taught Michel Legrand and some very famous people. Aaron Copland studied with her.
Wow.
Lots and lots. Anyway, I while I was in Paris, I went to a concert where I heard a piece by Karlheinz Stockhausen called Kontakte,
Mm-hmm.
which is a four-channel piece which he made in studio in Cologne with rotating loudspeaker and four microphones on a table.
Mm-hmm.
And this he recorded these rotational movements of sound moving in space, and it really caught my ear. So I thought, someday I would like to write music for uh, for loudspeakers, where the loudspeaker is this purpose. It's not in those days, except for Les Paul and Mary Ford. Recordings, loudspeakers were for reproducing television shows or concerts and whatnot. But actually, where the loudspeaker is the point, making music for loudspeakers was unknown except for those very advanced, adventurous couple, Les
Sure.
Paul, Mary Ford,
I
which
assume
is
this is
amazing.
at a time where people were using laboratory oscillators and
Yeah, yeah,
filters and cutting up
yeah,
tape to
right,
construct electronic music
yeah.
pieces.
So this was in 70, 51, 61, 61 when I
Okay.
heard Stockhausen's piece. So after studying with Boulanger, I thought I got to get a degree and went far away from the East Coast or the Midwest, which I both knew, of course, and went to California and got into Stanford graduate program in music composition,
So
and was just
did you see yourself as going into the world of being a professional composer?
yeah. Thought, well, that's you have to do something, and that seemed like
Sure.
putting off big decisions. People often go into school, get a degree, and
Sure.
get another one. Right. So uh, I was really disappointed that there was no facility nor even interest in electronic music of any sort. And so I played in the Stanford Orchestra, and I played timpani. And next to me was a drummer, percussionist, who was a biologist by training. And during breaks, or where percussion have lots of breaks in symphonic music, she and I talked about various things, and I told her about my interest in in electronic music and from my experience in Paris. One day she came in, she handed me an article she had cut out of Science, and this article was by Max Matthews,
Ah,
and the name of the article was "The Digital Computer as a Musical Instrument."
a famous
Di-
paper.
yeah, the famous paper. And so I put it in my pocket and thought, okay, I'll thanked her, of course. And a couple weeks later, this was maybe in November 1963, and I read the article, and I understood very little. But what I did understand was a diagram in this article, which had a computer, a digital analog converter, and a loudspeaker. And this was the basic idea of sampling.
Sure.
Claude Shannon's famous 1959 article, I think, called Communication Theory, which of course Max knew very well because they were colleagues in at Bell Labs. And in this paper, this diagram really caught my attention because I didn't understand much about the paper. It was all kind of technical. As I said, I had no technical background. I'd never been a ham operator. My whole background was music.
Hmm.
But I thought, okay, if I could learn to program a computer, then I could bypass all the technical knowledge that Stockhausen involved was involved with in producing his works. Big patch bays and wires and plug-in cables. The whole story.
Sure.
And so I thought, if I could learn to play, you know, program, I can bypass all that. Have a direct line from computer to the converter to the loudspeaker. So I took a programming course. This was early in Stanford's computer uh, computer science department history,
Hmm.
and they set up a course for for non-technical people, and they taught this course for people like me, and it was a very, very well constructed course. They divided this big class, maybe a couple hundred, you know, undergraduates and graduates, none of whom were engineers or math people, into groups. And we had some of us were memories, some of us were accumulators, and our hands went up like we were bits and bytes. I mean, it was a really well done course.
So that leads to a question. Well, what language did you learn to program at that time? Was it
Al-
assembler?
Algol. They
Algol?
taught Algol. This
Wow.
was, and the machine that was used was a Burroughs 5000,
Okay.
which was a design where it was optimized for the Algol language, the
I see.
basic machine language. And so I learned to program in Algol. Then, so really happily, I went to Bell Labs and asked Max if he could help me set up a system at Stanford because we had a IBM 7090 just
Mainframe.
as they mainframe that they had at Bell Labs at the time, on which he had based his program, his paper, and which he had programmed what they call Music 4. And he started Music 1 was in 1957.
Mm-hmm.
Just as a little parentheses, that was the first time a a digital computer made music. I mean, there are other people who used a computer like Turing
Sure.
early on, but that was not based upon, acoustic theory. They would like maybe
So
using them.
I
Yeah,
wonder if those initial experiments were computers controlling like analog oscillators, or were they actually generating the tones with the computer itself?
of Max's, you mean?
Mm-hmm.
No, it was digital analog converters.
Oh, okay. I see. Interesting.
Yeah,
Fascinating.
yeah, yeah. And so Max in 1957 produced the first computer, which is actually a sine wave.
Okay. Okay.
So his work was based upon acoustics that had reached back to Helmholtz back even before, and so he's really the father of the digital domain.
Oh, most definitely.
Yeah, without any question. I mean, Turing, I think I forget what he did. Maybe he banged the accumulators and got some radio frequencies,
Mm-hmm.
and I forget. But it was not based upon acoustic theory. So on with the story, I came back to Stanford from this visit with Max with a box of cards and standing in front of the computer center, wondering how in the world I'm ever going to get this to go work. And the tuba player in the orchestra was standing there. Now I had known David Poole for 3 years, 2 years as a tuba player, very good one. And he said, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "What are you doing here?" And he said, "Well, I'm taking John McCarthy's course in Lisp and AI. Would you like to?" I said, "I'm trying to get this program to go." And he said, "Well, tell me about it." And he said, "I can help you." So David Poole was not only the guy who put together the first version of Music 4 on a PDP-10 computer, DEC Digital Equipment Corporation. Of course,
Mm-hmm.
none of these companies exist any longer. But he also was my angel. He taught me everything. Taught me what a bit was, what was a byte. Taught me how to what a core dump was, taught me Fortran, and which was the programming language of the day.
Certainly.
And so he was my angel. He was the Esterhazy in my life. You gave me the means, and I'm forever grateful to Dave, and I've made that public many, many times.
One of those people in your life who really change your
Yeah,
direction. It's
yeah,
fascinating.
right. Serendipity. So that I'm here talking to you at all is completely chance.
Sure, of course.
Yeah, that's the way it is, right?
So I'm curious about leading up into your research into quote unquote discovering FM audio synthesis.
Yeah,
You did some work on audio spatialization.
yes. That was my first project. I wanted to do what Stockhausen had done, but I wanted to do it in a more general way. So rather than just rotational, uh, once I had Max's program and I understood how to use it, I built a program in Fortran that allowed me to move a source in arbitrary paths in an illusory space. And
Now, is
this,
that just like panning back and forth in between left and right speakers or headphones, or was there
no,
more to it than that?
I had a 4 channel. I have a little demonstration on a PowerPoint. If you want to share screen, I can show you how that worked.
Yeah,
From the very beginning of my work in '64 at the AI Lab, I worked on the simulation of moving sound sources as auditory illusions, realizing my dream. In the next slide, I will describe the graphic spatialization program that was fully implemented when Ligeti, famous composer at the time,
Oh, I'm very
arrived at
familiar with
Stanford.
him.
Yeah, 1972. Well, that's a whole other story, which we can perhaps talk about. By 1968, I had acquired a 4-channel DAC, and my experiments were extended from stereo to quadraphonic.
That's
The
it.
spatialization parameters are named according to the Cartesian coordinates because there was no standard at that time.
Mm-hmm.
So channel 1, channel 2, channel 3, channel 4. The audience is within the listener space, and the illusory sound space is beyond its perimeter. By programming, it made possible for me to find by graphic means the trajectory and velocity for a moving sound source. The distance, the intensity of the direct signal decreases with increase in distance, but the intensity of the reverberation remains constant. All right, so as basically I'm sampling the trajectory. The trajectory is arbitrary. It can be
Mm-hmm.
go to infinity in distance, etc. So I could draw, like with a mouse on a screen, a trajectory and then run it through my program, and it would figure out the control functions, which we'll see in a moment.
So
Uh,
that would be like a combination of the percentage in each speaker as it rotates around
yes,
360. I
right.
guess
Yeah,
volume to make it appear further
yeah,
and
right.
closer.
Exactly. And then,
Fascinating.
well, the direct to reverberant signal is the key for distance.
Ah, I see.
So as the direct signal increases in distance, the reverberation remains constant in intensity. So the auditory system then measures, makes a decision. Okay, is the direct signal softer because it's softer at the source, close, or softer because it's of lesser intensity, or is it because it's far away? So reverberation tells the auditory system if the reverberation hasn't changed, then the source must be at distance.
Ah,
Okay, so this is equivalent to perspective,
sure.
what they call uh, size constancy. You know, an image is far away, like a car is tiny, but perspective provides the context to tell us it's tiny at the retina because of its distance from the eye.
Sure.
And so in audio, in perception, it's equivalent to loudness constancy. So reverberation tells us how how loud the source is at its position in space.
And so at that time, you were actually able to generate that reverberant
Yes,
component.
yeah, based upon Schroeder's work at Bell Labs.
Ah, I
Manfred
see.
Schroeder, yeah, a colleague of Max's who figured out how to make artificial reverberation that was smooth and didn't have big lumps. It's what Stockhausen used was a reverberation chamber
Sure.
at in Cologne. So this was all digital, although not real time.
Of
course.
course, compute power at that time wasn't
Yeah,
probably
this,
sufficient yet.
yeah, this was a PDP-10.
Interesting.
So this is what I imagined when I sort of began my work after having heard Contacta. But beyond the AI Lab, Max Matthews and Jean-Claude Risset and colleagues at Bell Labs, no one knew of the work we had accomplished at Stanford.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a nice demonstration of the distance cue. So let me play that for you, and
Sure.
it'll become very clear what's going on. This is the scheme with which I realized the the effects that I'm about to show you. All right. Let's see. Uh, well, let me go through. This is part of my story.
Okay.
This is the signal flow and the way the processing worked. I've highlighted and discovered FM synthesis, the culmination of all they had learned since beginning in 1964.
Mm-hmm.
I discovered FM in 1967, and that was an ear discovery. I can say a little bit more about that because it bears upon what you're about. So this was a very important moment in my personal history and in the direction that the computer music project and eventually CCRMA would take, CCRMA's Center for Computer Research in Music and Acoustics.
Mm-hmm.
While computers were not yet powerful enough to synthesize and process sound in real time, hands-on and favoring immediate response, they would be someday. But the computer brought to music something else. Computer synthesis provided the composer direct control of the material of music to compose the sound itself, or from the inside out, so to speak. I also realized that computer programming allowed us to accomplish two very different but complementary tasks. Joining the structure, see, I'm a little ahead, joining the structure of the sound itself to the structure of musical form, which I did, for example, in a couple of my pieces, most notably Strio, which I composed in 1977. I also understood the importance that the importance of diverse disciplines and the population of researchers at the Artificial Intelligence Lab, computer scientists and electrical engineers, of course. But there were also other disciplines, a philosopher, a linguist, a physicist, and a psychiatrist even. And we in the computer music project were, in a sense, students, and we found in these colleagues patient teachers who willingly answered our questions as they watched us build a new means for making and representing music. Finally, I realized my ears were my most important tools.
Certainly.
That those having motivation and perseverance, but no special competence in building electronic devices, were presented with a means to engage in a medium and at a high level of abstraction that was a defining music advance in the 20th century, music composed for loudspeakers. So, but how to simulate, this is loudness and distance.
Core.
Okay. How to simulate the other dimension, distance, was not clear, yet it was perfectly clear on recordings of the day. Let's see, I've got to move your, there we go. In a complex, it's a complex percept that is linked to intensity, spectrum, and a reverberant field, and one which is robust, independent of the listener's relationship to the loudspeaker. Distance and loudness are subjective, and here we see how they relate to intensity, spectrum, and reverberation. We will relate the physical space to subjective space by nesting one within the other. As composers, we wish to manipulate the perceptual effect, and to do that, we must manipulate the physical dimensions. Let's see here, I have to get. In general, the perceptual correlates of amplitude and frequency are loudness and pitch. But as we have seen, loudness is not so simple. If we change frequency, we change pitch. And if we change amplitude or intensity and centroid, we change loudness. Now we add another perceptual dimension, distance. Now the two-dimensional space nested in a three-dimensional space. What does distance have to do with loudness? Loudness constancy. If we change amplitude and the reverberation remains constant, we change perceived distance, but not perceived loudness. As in vision, perspective tells us that while the retinal image is smaller, the object is the same size. So in the auditory domain, reverberation and constant centroid or bandwidth tell us that while the overall intensity is less, the sound is at the same loudness or effort or force at the source position in space. So this is change in loudness where the source is not going a distance, just decreasing its loudness, and we see a change in centroid. So the change in centroid tells us that it's becoming softer at a constant distance. And then it compares the two. Okay.
So how did that research lead into this FM discovery?
Okay. So in searching for distance cue,
Okay.
I needed a signal that differentiated itself from the reverberant signal. And because of, for example, if you have just a sine wave with a smooth curve envelope as a sound source, the reverberant field and the source are undifferentiated. The ear
Right,
can't
because it's
distinguish.
such a simple single
Yeah,
harmonic tone, right?
right. Yeah, yeah. And in fact, it doesn't matter. It could be many harmonics, but still the reverberation is only delayed by a few milliseconds, and we can't hear any distinction. So the ear, of course, is most sensitive to small changes in pitch. So I thought, as a violinist, I knew, okay, then maybe vibrato is a way to, if I add vibrato to the direct source, then it would separate itself from the reverberant field, which would be a complex mix of vibration, and the vibrato's there, but we don't hear it as a single vibrato. It's a mix of phases, etc.,
Exactly.
in the feedback. So I tried that and I thought, gee, that works. I've got something here that will allow me to do what I wanted to do, which was distinguish the direct signal from the reverberant field.
Signal. Okay, interesting.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm sitting at the computer and I thought, gee, vibrato, I knew as a kid, you go up and down about 6 or 7 times per second, but, the computer doesn't care. I could take this up and down 20 times per second. And so I started doing experiments. And I went up, tried making the vibrato using a sine wave controlling a sine wave, the simplest case. no, 20 times per second, then 80 times. And at some point I realized, I'm not listening in the time domain now. I'm not tracking pitch through space. I'm hearing a difference in timbre,
Exactly.
like became like motorboating, then at 100 times per second. Okay, so I was using a tone, the kind of center frequency, I called it, of 200 hertz.
Okay.
And so I thought, well, I'll try it plus or minus 200 hertz and see what happens. And then at 200 times per second, and what I heard was a complex tone with lots of harmonics. And I thought, well, with two oscillators, I'm producing a tone with, I couldn't tell exactly, but I knew it was a bunch of harmonics, maybe 8 or 9 or 10. And I thought that at the time, the only way to do that was with additive synthesis, which Jean-Claude Risset had done at Bell Labs. So for him to produce that same tone, he would have required 9 or 10 oscillators. And I thought, this is interesting. So I transposed everything an octave above, and it was not chaotic, it was orderly. Then I tried different rates. So it was a long night of discovery with about, sometimes I would wait depending on it was a time shared system. So I had to compete for compute cycles.
Of course.
Yeah. And sometimes I have to wait for a 2-second sound sample to come back and play it through the converter. But while I was waiting, I was always thinking, what if I hear this, what will I do next, etc. So, and I recorded what I was doing, wrote down all the parameters, which weren't many. And this was sometime in probably between Thanksgiving and Christmas in 1967. And then I went home. I was living in Palo Alto, Stanford. I went home to Wilmington, Delaware for Christmas and went to Bell Labs and showed Jean-Claude Risset what I was doing and Max Matthews. And Jean-Claude wrote down the data. So I didn't date my notes, so I don't know exactly the date because I wasn't trained as a scientist. So I didn't date notes, but I'd had the notes. But he recorded them, and we have a documentation of his
Which
writing down
which
to
Bell Labs facility was that at? I'm curious.
Murray Hill.
Oh, Murray Hill, of course. Okay, the
Yeah,
place where the transistor was invented.
right. And that was, John Pierce
Mm-hmm.
is
Great.
the one who named it, of course. And so Jean-Claude dated his notes of writing down my data and listening to the examples. It was December 18th, 1967. So that we know for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And Max, they were both impressed. Jean-Claude then used it in one of his versions of Mutations, one of what I think is one of his greatest early works. And at the end, he uses what he called sign sweeping or something.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't call it FM because we hadn't figured out the relationship. It was Dave Poole who later took me to the library and we looked up in Terman's radio engineering text
Of course.
about FM and broadcasting. And of course, what they use is a sinusoid modulating a sinusoid as their,
Carrier and modulation frequencies.
yeah,
Exactly.
right. And so what they described was exactly what I was doing, except I was doing it in the audio band and I was not demodulating the signal.
Correct.
I,
Right.
I, so that was how FM was discovered.
So did you have access to like spectrum analyzers to look
Oh,
at the? Oh
no,
wow! So this is all by
no,
ear, really,
all
at the
my
time,
year.
because I was curious as to how one went about one of the things that's always intimidation might be a strong word, but one of the things that's always intimidated me about FM synthesis is if you know in your head what you want to hear, how do you translate to that to the appropriate algorithm with the appropriate modulators against the appropriate carrier frequencies? It always seemed like a big math project to me.
Yeah. Well, you keep it simple. It's the way
Okay.
I build complex FM structures by using I guess my basic most useful form is one modulating oscillator and two carriers, and
Okay.
the two carriers can be independently. Their parameter, all three parameters are independent. So, for example, to create a resonance, you make you might make the one carrier the same as the modulating frequency, but at low index,
Okay.
and then the other one, a multiple of the pitch frequency with a small index, which gives you then a kind of a resonant curve.
I see. So by index, you mean amount of modulation signal applied to
Yeah,
the carrier?
that's right. That's right.
Interesting. Very
Yeah,
interesting. And then I would imagine eventually you're using envelopes to control the
yeah,
frequency of
exactly.
your modulation on and your
Right,
amplitude of your
right,
modulation on to get
right.
all kinds of
Yeah,
interesting changes over time.
yeah,
And really the only way to do that is with computers. I would imagine trying to do that with laboratory oscillators would be
yeah,
arduous.
yeah. But Dave Bristow and Gary Leuenberger, the two guys who voiced the DX7,
Mm-hmm.
the factory voices, they had this ear because they were both keyboard players, which I went to Hamamatsu in Japan maybe 10 times after they took the option on the license in 1972, I think, to help them develop the FM structure. They they're the only company that Stanford Office of Technology Licensing ever gave an exclusive license to.
Oh, fascinating.
Yeah,
Yeah, that is a
because
little bit unusual, isn't it?
yeah, because they Yamaha said, look, the amount of investment that we have to put into developing this is
Significant.
enormous because there was no way to build a real time instrument at that time. And then, of course, with the evolution of large integrated
The
chip
LSI,
technology,
right?
yeah, LSI and then super LSI, etc. By 1983, they had the DX7, and the first one was the GS1,
Mm-hmm.
and that was 2 years before. And we have one at Stanford. We
We have one here also.
Yeah, and if you lift up and you look at the number of chips, like it must be 50 or so chips, and then the DX7 inside there are about two that do the FM part,
Mm-hmm.
replacing probably more than half of those 50 chips in the GS1. So that was in over the period of 3 years. The first GS1, I think, was produced in 71, marketed in 71, but it was built and designed in 1970, I think.
1970.
Yeah.
Oh wow, that's a longer ago
No,
than
right. 1980. Sorry.
1980. Okay, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was marketed in 1971.
Ah, fascinating. So yeah, so they spent like 8 years, I guess,
Yes.
developing that technology, and I
Right.
guess doing a lot of experimentation to see
Yeah.
what modulations on what carriers would produce what sounds.
Right.
Like a tuba or a trombone or a
Yeah.
timpani.
Yeah.
These are
Yeah.
complicated sounds.
So I gave them all the things that I had done, which
Mm-hmm.
pitch scaling, you change all these parameters according to pitch height, because the bandwidth of spectrum from all musical instruments becomes you know less complex with pitch height.
So modulating a carrier frequency, were the results like as expected and linear, or were there like non-linearities in it? Like
Lots of,
really?
yeah. So the brass tone, which was the one that was most surprising, that Jean-Claude Risset had analyzed at Bell Labs and reproduced with additive synthesis, was so simple. What he realized was during the attack portion of, say, of a trumpet tone, during the first 20 or 30 milliseconds, the harmonics rise according to the harmonic number. So it
Okay.
goes wah, like that. Wah. So I remembered that when I was working on some of the tones. This was before we even licensed it to Yamaha, and realized that if I let the modulation index and the brass-like
Mm-hmm.
envelope be the same, then I would produce exactly the same note, because they're going from the modulation at some zero, where there's only no harmonics,
Mm-hmm.
to some index value which gave the same effect. So, like within 20 minutes of non-real time, of course, with waits between, I had these incredibly realistic brass tones
That's
with
amazing.
two oscillators.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and it transposed. I
Mm-hmm.
put it
Sure.
on the octave and increased the index, and it sounded like a tuba, or
Okay.
less so like a trombone or horn or something in the mid range. So it was a real breakthrough, and the realization was this perceptual aspect, the perceptual realization
Mm-hmm.
was that complex spectra of musical instruments correlate with pitch height and time dependent envelopes.
That makes complete sense.
You know, this internal dynamism of a pitch. So things like a little skew during the attack, or random, a small amount of random vibrato to disturb the periodicity, because the ear, as soon as it hears something that's periodic, it knows exactly, okay, this is artificial.
Mm-hmm.
And the eye, too, if it sees perfect symmetry, it, it's not as interesting as something that's quasi-symmetric.
Right. Exactly.
Like if you look at the great cathedrals like Notre Dame, Paris, and you stand right in front of it and flick your eyes back and forth, there's lots of intended differences, but things like the distance from the outer edges of the first portal on the right and left of the central portal, there's differences of, probably a meter sometimes even. So if the master builders were measuring with a wet rope, they could have done better than that. So it's clearly intentional.
Right.
Yeah. So this is the aspect of artistry that people don't think about, but it's so important to everything we do.
Yeah. There's a sort of a classic history of that. You know, the Celts would, in their Celtic knotwork, would always leave an error
Yeah.
because they didn't want to quote unquote offend the gods by
Yeah.
creating something that's
Yeah.
perfect. So that
Yeah.
probably pervaded our
Yes.
consciousness and continued on into the future.
Right.
That's really fascinating. Um,
Well, that was probably the excuse, but I think that the artistry in the builders or painters was they understood that the eye needs these small imperfections.
exactly.
And they say, well, why is it imperfect? Oh, because God said we wanted to differentiate.
Yeah, that's a rule that applies to photography as well. You know, the difference
Yeah,
between a good picture and a bad picture can just be where the subject is placed in the frame.
right.
One of doing my research, there was a term that you used in one of the interviews that I watched that kind of summed that up really well. what we were just describing before that, internal dynamism.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
all of these different changes in pitch of the modulation oscillator in
Right.
combination with
Yeah.
envelopes gives you that internal dynamism that some
Right.
instruments, like plucking a string on a bass guitar,
Yeah.
how
Right.
things change over time. That's fascinating. So, how did what came after this discovery? How did or before I ask you that, how did Yamaha become aware of this?
So when I did these brass tones,
Mm-hmm.
I knew that this was a breakthrough.
Sure.
There was no electronic instrument analog at the time instrument could do this, and so I contacted the Office of Technology Licensing and said, "Look, I think there's some application here, and you want to look into it." So they put a graduate business school, gave him a summer project, paid him
Ah,
to check out all the possible companies who might be interested in licensing this technology. So they found out, okay, the big one was Hammond, of course,
of course.
but then there was Lowry
Mm-hmm.
and another couple
Wurlitzer,
too.
maybe, or
Wurlitzer, right? Okay, all three of whom sent an engineer. Each of them sent an engineer to evaluate, and they said they had no understanding of digital domain.
of course
No,
not. Yeah.
so they said, "How do you do this?" They were impressed with the sounds. I played them some violin-like tones and brass tones and percussive tones, endless. But percussive are so easy.
Mm-hmm.
And so they would always say, "Well, how many chips does it take?" And I said, "Look, I'm just a musician fooling around with computers, but I have this program and this is how it works." And I showed them the music, or by now the PDP-10 version of the code that I used. And they,
Mm-hmm.
you know, walked away dumbfounded. One of the people Hammond sent, by the way, was Don Lewis. Do you know
Okay.
that?
It rings a
Don,
bell.
yeah. There's a film out called, what's it called? About Don Lewis, a black musician from,
Oh, Don Lewis.
yes,
Yeah, I definitely know who Don Lewis is.
yeah, yeah. And he was a demonstrator
Mm-hmm.
for, and he came out, he was blown away. And I also played these illusions of spatial illusions, which I have shown you. And he went back and said, "Yes, this is great stuff." So maybe they sent him first, and then they sent the engineer,
Mm-hmm.
and the engineer didn't get it. So nor did Lowry, nor did the same thing with Wurlitzer. None of them
Mm-hmm.
understood. So finally, they looked again and discovered that Yamaha was the largest music instrument manufacturer in the world, although their footprint in the United States was very small,
Mm-hmm.
just pianos. They built pianos
Sure.
and or they sold pianos, but they built them in Hamamatsu. But they used wood from Georgia. They imported timber for making their pianos,
Interesting.
and so uh, OTL contacted them and said, "Look, we have this idea. Maybe you would be interested, knowing that their organ uh, manufacturing in Asia was huge, especially in Japan. They were building 180,000 organs a month, and
Yeah, I think at that point they would have been building analog synthesizers too.
yeah, it was all analog
Mm-hmm.
and analog synthesizers. Yeah, massive ones. Big ones that were
Oh,
incredibly,
sure.
incredibly powerful. And so they contacted uh, Yamaha in Orange County and said, "This is interesting." So it happened to be that one of the Yamaha managers or engineering managers was in Georgia, checking out wood products to ship to Japan to build pianos, and they had him make a quick trip up to Stanford, and I showed him what I was doing, and he understood in about 10 minutes the whole thing. Said, "I got it." Because they were already investigating digital control, and they knew about Max's work and sampling.
Sure.
So they were completely informed in regard to the digital domain. So he understood. They went back, and within, I don't know, a couple of months, they contacted OTL and said, "We'd like to talk to you about exercising an option." OTL said, "Okay." And they required that they pay a certain amount to Stanford every year for this option, like $50,000 a year. And in those days was a lot of money.
Sure.
And but it would be deducted from any eventual income from products.
Mm-hmm.
So they took the option and went right to work. And that's how all of that happened.
That'll lead me into another question. Apparently, you were part of creating the Center for Computer Research in Music and Acoustics.
Yeah.
So tell me about how
So
that came about and why it came about. And
okay. So um, let's see. I began this work at the Stanford AI Lab in 1964,
mm-hmm.
and then uh, I was made an assistant professor. And in 19, so after an assistant professor, first after 3 years, they
Mm-hmm.
allow you to go on as an assistant professor for 3 more. Then you either get promoted or you go somewhere else. They put you at the door. So I had a sabbatical leave, and I took my family, and we went to France, where of course, I knew Jean-Claude Risset, and he was living in Marseille at that time, teaching at the University of Marseille Lumini, and so there were lots of contacts and with him and his family, whom I knew very well since 1964, and we had a sailboat, and we sailed around, which is one of my passions. And we had borrowed money from Stanford to buy it,
Oh,
and
great.
and then uh, in touring through the Mediterranean from Cannes in Provence, the city of Cannes, to Italy, and then to Ischia, the island of Ischia. We stayed for the winter, and I heard while there that I had not been promoted, that I had to go away.
Uh-oh.
Yep, big problem. I had this little family, and I wrote the FM paper while I was in Ischia. I borrowed a typewriter in a hotel just on the quay, and
Mm-hmm.
they let me type at night and type this paper. And Max did a final edit, and it got published in 1972.
Mm-hmm.
I'd already published the spatialization paper in 1971, the simulation of moving sound sources.
Mm-hmm.
And the FM paper was then published in 72, both in the Audio Engineering Society journal. So we were stuck. But Boulez became interested in our work.
Okay.
and he was just forming the plans for building IRCAM in Paris. This
Earcom, of
huge,
course. I expected it
very,
was going in that direction.
yeah, yeah. And so Ligeti told him to see what's going on at Stanford in computer music, because Ligeti had spent 5 months at Stanford and was amazed at what we were doing. We had, I had the full-blown uh, spatialization program and these FM programs, and he was there when I did the first performance of Tyrannus, which was the culmination of all my work over from the very beginning. This was where I finally understood FM in depth, and so Tyrannus, it makes use of all the spatialization and FM metamorphoses, changing from noise to brass to
Mm-hmm.
noises, all sorts of changes. And so when he went back to, after his 5 months at Stanford, he ran into Boulez and he said, pay attention to what's going on at Stanford. So then when I went back, uh, we decided I couldn't leave because all my whole investment was in the AI lab.
Mm-hmm.
So we put together a NSF proposal that was funded. We didn't use the term music, but sound processing.
Okay.
But really, it was really about, you know, timbre, perception. We all used all the words that,
Yeah, I would imagine using the word music would push
yeah,
you into
yeah,
different grants, right?
yeah, yeah. No, don't want any part of that.
That was
And
clever.
it was given to us.
Mm-hmm.
So I was appointed then just as a research associate, but at least we had salary from
Sure.
this grant. And then uh, in all of a sudden, the music department realized that, well, Boulez is inviting Chowning and colleagues to go help form, IRCAM, and we convinced Boulez hire Max as a scientific advisor, and it changed the whole direction. IRCAM would have been a big analog studio and obsolete by the time they opened in
Right.
1970. And it
Fascinating.
really, yeah, really changed the whole direction of EarCom. And so Max had one of the EarCom engineers who was building this massive analog device for Luciano Berio, had him go to Bell Labs, and one of his colleagues, Hal Alice,
Of
uh,
course.
instruct him about digital domain hardware, how to design and build. So it changed the whole direction of all right. So I had been fired, but we had become famous in the world of new music, especially with the contact with Yerkam and Boulez. So the University of California, San Diego, offered me a full professorship.
Ah,
Okay, so I went from research associate, and I think just before they had given me an adjunct professor, which means not really a professor, but
yeah, no tenure, right?
yeah, no tenure, to then Stanford matched it and gave me full professorship.
Ah, okay, good.
It's probably the only case in Stanford history where someone has gone from assistant professor to full professor without having been an associate professor.
Wow.
So they realized they had made
Yeah, an error. Yeah,
right.
clearly.
And yeah, the reason is that the person in charge of the music department that at that time, when they didn't grant me tenure in 1972, he was an engineer who was an amateur cellist.
Mm-hmm.
So he read the paper, FM paper, and gave it a cursory look and didn't really understand what I was doing, and just dismissed it as someone playing in a field which he knew a lot about. And I had no business there, basically.
Yeah, it was a different time.
Yeah, it was a different time. So that was when in 1979, we were still then a computer music project, and we decided that the computer project needed its own kind of funding source because the music department had no idea of how to handle NSF contracts, etc. So
Right.
we formed Karma in 1974, and we had our own administrative structure, and the income from the final many millions of dollars that were paid by Yamaha for the which was more than 25 million, I think. I don't know what that's
Wow.
equal in today's dollars, but it was a lot of money. With some great part of that went to support Karma and still supports Karma. They invested it in the you know in the university investment portfolios, and that the guy who did that lived through the downswing at Stanford did just fine. He's the highest paid. He was the highest paid employee of Stanford. In fact, the
Well, that makes me
investment had.
happy.
Yeah, yeah. So our income grew with with Stanford's overall investment.
That's fantastic. That's a story that you don't hear often enough.
Right.
So another question, and when in my research, I read or heard you mentioned something about um, using FM to imitate the human voice, and that you
Yeah.
learned a lot from doing.
Yes.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So Jean-Claude Risset was made the uh, director of the computer department at IRCAM.
Mm-hmm.
And after I presented STRIA in 1977 at IRCAM, they became really interested in the work I was doing. Jean-Claude invited me back for a year. So as a project, I took on the idea that had been set in my mind by Mike McNabb, one of our graduate students in the early days, who made an extraordinarily beautiful piece called Dream Song.
Mm-hmm.
If your listeners have a chance, it's available. But his idea was to produce the singing voice by just using a fixed spectrum, but to use the frequency trace of the soprano through time. That is the fundamental frequency through time
Mm-hmm.
applied to this. And it turned out it sounded unbelievably like a soprano tone. So this was in my mind when
Mm-hmm.
Jean-Claude invited me in 1978. And I thought, well, as a project to get started, instead of working on a piece right away to familiarize myself with the system, I'll try and build FM voices
Okay.
based based upon this incredible insight that I'd gained from Mike McNabb's work.
Mm-hmm.
And so it took me about 2 months to figure out how to do it. The basic idea is I had one modulator and then two or three carrier frequencies.
Mm-hmm.
And these carrier were frequencies were integer multiples of the modulating frequency, which was always at the pitch frequency.
Okay.
So the modulator frequency is always F0.
Mm-hmm.
So if I want a resonance at, say, the second harmonic, then I made the first carrier two times the modulating frequency with a small index or index, which could be the curve of which could be changed according to the value of the index. A
Okay.
small index was very narrow, increased a little bit from, say, zero point 0.5 to 1, it became broad. And then if the index increases, then it breaks into sidebands on either side, which I avoided. So I
Right.
kept it small and manageable.
Mm-hmm.
And if the index is small, it's more or less linear, so it doesn't screw up your head like
Right.
4 stacked oscillators. I have no idea what that in as they have in the DX7.
Mm-hmm.
So okay, so that's one resonance. Then if I want another, say at the 7th harmonic, the next carrier is 7 times the modulating frequency, and I could control its amplitude. So that's the basic structure. I could create three resonances with 1 modulator and 3 carriers.
Fascinating.
That's the basic structure. Then it took me about 5 months to make it all sound real. That's where the internal dynamism comes in. How to create a vibrato that, and I was basing these. I should add that the resonance for a given vowel in the singing voice changes according to fundamental pitch.
Mm-hmm.
So as the pitch frequency, the soprano it sings up the scale, the formants in speech they're called, which in this case we call them resonances,
Mm-hmm.
they they may decrease. In fact, when a soprano sings at the highest of her register, they all converge to 1.
Ah, I see.
That's the only way she can get in bel canto singing the is
Right.
to
Exactly.
jaw down, tongue flat, mouth. So they all converge pretty much to 1 or 2, maybe 2 resonances.
And this was all done by experimentation in ear.
And insight from, at this time, Johann Sundberg, who was a great voice researcher in the Technical Institute in Sweden, in Stockholm. He was there, invited by IRCAM on another project. And so he had done this research, and I interacted with him,
Mm-hmm.
and he showed me how the resonance structures or the formants change with pitch height. So
Fascinating.
I had this mapping, which was I built into my program. So the the uh, pitches which I did with, the examples were stunningly real, and it got his imagination because he had done it all with analog, you know, systems
That's
using
impressive.
resonators, etc. Now, the way he got the trajectories was very interesting. He asked a willing but very good soprano to sing at various pitches and then to freeze her mouth, jaw, tongue position. And then he put a buzzer where her vocal folds
Of
are in the
course.
throat,
Right. Mm-hmm.
which then he looked at the spectrum analyzer and saw where the resonances were.
That's
And
fascinating.
especially at the high one, because there are not many resonances. That's how we figured out what the at the top of the range
You're
was.
just looking at the limitations of the human vocal cords there.
But yeah,
Isn't that
yeah.
fascinating?
But it was a brilliant way to to do that.
So obviously, for one to pursue endeavors like this, one has to have a strong sense of curiosity.
Yeah,
Is there anything that you're curious about today?
I'm still working.
Oh, are you? Okay. See, I wasn't even aware of that. So, what are you working
Oh,
on
yeah.
today?
Oh, I'm working on a, a big patch for exploring FM that
Okay.
I wrote for, like a playground for FM. I'm
Oh,
working,
interesting.
yeah, I'm working on a couple of pieces.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, look, I'm going to be 90 in August. So,
Congratulations.
and I don't stop. The point is, keep moving. So I'm going to Copenhagen in next month,
Okay.
where they're doing a concert of my works, and then from there to Paris, and I'll go to Marseille, where Jean Claude's uh, children still live. I maintain very close contact with them after Jean Claude died in 2016,
Mm-hmm.
and his wife the year after. So the smallest child, Solène Rissé, she's now in her early 50s, I guess. Uh, I learned from her how to pronounce the French R, because when I first knew her, she was a toddler, about 1.5, 2 years old.
Oh,
I
that's
remember
cute.
her mother telling her, Solène, c'est la rue, how to say the street, la, the guttural R. So I learned from her.
That's great.
And we're very close. And so I always go visit her. Also, at the University of Marseille, there's a big project in computer music. They invite me to give their talk. It's about my work. So no, I'm very active, and I keep keep going. I will go to Seoul for the International Computer Music Conference in July, and I love my work.
Yeah, it's absolutely, and I think many people around the world who are into using computers to make music, which is just about everyone at this point.
Yeah,
Definitely have to thank you and folks like Max Matthews and other folks who worked on this stuff, and
yeah, yeah.
we're certainly appreciative here at EMEAPP, which a big part of our focus is education. So I thank you very much for talking to us today. I
It has
appreciate
been a
your time, and
pleasure.
I learned a lot. It's been very good.
Thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks so much. You have a great day, and hopefully, if you're ever in the Philadelphia area, you can come and visit us.